Welcome, everyone. It's lovely to have you here today on this lovely Saturday. I'm Brandie Waid. I'm a former middle and high school math teacher and currently work as a math coach and as well as consultant and a teacher educator in New Jersey. So there is a bit.ly link here that will have all the resources for you. There's a full resource page that it'll navigate you to. It has the slides on it. It has a definitions page in case there are any LGBT terms that come up that you're unfamiliar with, though I will try to define them, as well as any of the references that we talk about throughout the Jamboard that we are going to use during this session. So when you go to that bit.ly link, it'll actually take you to a page that asks for you to agree to some community agreements. Just in general, make sure that we are committing to controversy with civility, where we know that varying opinions are expected, with a group commitment to understand the source of disagreement and work towards a common solution. Owning intentions and impact, and knowing that intentions and impact are different. Challenge by choice, so we have the option of stepping in and out of challenging conversations and engaging in the way that feels good for us. Respect, where we show respect for everyone and know that someone's definition of respect might be a little bit different than our own, and being mindful of that. No attack, where members agree not to intentionally inflict harm. Again, intent and impact are different, so keep that in mind with that as well. And then know what stays and goes. So anything that I'm sharing with you, feel free to take away from this workshop. But if someone shares a personal story with you, especially like in a breakout room or even during the whole group, maybe don't take that one away. So that sort of thing, knowing what stays and what goes. So a couple of things about me. I identify as a queer demi-woman. If you're not familiar with what a demi-woman is, essentially that means for me that I identify mostly as a woman or woman adjacent, and but sometimes non-binary feels more right. And sometimes I just use the term queer overall because I feel like that honors the queer and trans people of color specifically before me that were activists and used those terms in their advocacy. So queer feels like a way to honor them. I'm also a mild traumatic brain injury survivor and immunocompromised. And those have become very relevant throughout the pandemic when we rely a lot on screens, which was hard for me at the start of my brain injury, and when immunocompromised is still we have to make choices every day about what's safe to go out, when it's safe to go out and not. I'm also a white Latinx person of settler ancestry, and I think all of these things are important to acknowledge because they show up in the work that I do, especially in relation to talking about a liberatory queer, Black, queer, and trans anti-racist pedagogy. So for my queer identity, that shows up a lot in my own teaching in terms of me asking questions about how societal norms and binaries limit my view and behavior in mathematics and beyond, and how am I centering queer and trans joy, not just suffering. A lot of times the things we see, the representations are about suffering, they're about AIDS, they're about trans sports bans, and so forth, but like we really need to be focusing on the joy, not the suffering and the beauty. So those kind of impact me in that way. How can I better situate my teaching in a disability justice framework? Whenever I had my brain injury, it really kind of stopped me in my tracks in terms of considering like, oh, I have not historically been very accessible in my own teaching. So how can I do better when that now and as I recover? And then the last one, my white Latinx person of settler ancestry identity, that's really important specifically for this session as well, because I will never have an inherent understanding of what it means to practice an anti-racist, queer, and trans math pedagogy, precisely because I am not Black or Afro-Latinx. And I think that's important to acknowledge, but it's also important to acknowledge that that doesn't mean I should stop trying. That just means that I look to the words of people that live at those intersections and continue to learn and grow in my own practice. So to get us started in this journey, there are two scholars we're going to look at who identify as queer Black men in education. And they've done a lot of research on ballroom. Before we can talk about their research, you probably need to know what ballroom is. So I'm going to show a brief video that lets you engage with that question. And as we watch the video, I want you to consider the question, why might ballroom serve as a model for educators to understand how to create liberatory spaces for their Black, queer, and trans students? And that question, while you consider it, there is a Jamboard. Is this the one? Nope. There's a Jamboard for you to drop your response into. So that's also on the resource page. It's either the second or third link on the resource page that you can access and drop your notes into. Are there any questions before I press play? I'm gonna go ahead and press play. Keisha, could you give me a thumbs up that you can hear it when I press play?
Anybody that walks the floor, they walk like they are bigger than Beyonce. You have to walk in like you are the head honcho. You are the Barack. You are the Michelle. You know, you are the Mother Teresa. You are the Oprah for that moment. And when you battle, nobody can compete against you. You know, you always have to have this stern sense of confidence and self-acknowledgement of who you are. It's so important.
This is OTA, or Open to All. The weekly party is part of the city's vibrant ballroom scene. The balls are fierce competitions. Artists show off physically demanding dance routines. But ballroom represents more than a flashy spectacle. For many LGBTQ members, ballroom is where they feel at home.
Did ballroom give you a community that you didn't necessarily have prior?
What really drew me to it is the fact that it was a community rooted in a Black, Latino experience of LGBTQ identity. And I really felt like I saw myself to actually see people who look like you.
Author and trans activist Sydney Ballou discovered ballroom while attending graduate school in Europe. While the ball scene spans the globe today, it has a rich history in Manhattan. In the 1800s, African-American fraternal organizations started hosting masquerade ball fundraisers, where people would come dressed in drag.
People were able to express their true identity in an audacious way publicly by making themselves and who they were into entertainment for heterosexual people to enjoy, to leave their repressed stereotypical notions behind and to witness this transformation of these men into women.
Historian Michael Henry Adams says the balls were initially organized by heterosexual men, but became more associated with the gay community during the Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s. At the time, the explosion of art, music, and literature in Harlem created a vibrant gay nightlife. Drag queens were said to walk around rather openly, even though it was illegal for people to dress in clothes of the opposite sex.
Amongst Harlem's intelligentsia, there were so many people who were gay. If you look at the greats of the Harlem Renaissance, be they singers or writers or artists,
the balls typically made it into Harlem's newspapers, the coverage both flattering and offensive. The most famous ball of the day was the Hamilton Lodge Ball, a huge spectacle that took place annually at what was the Rockland Palace. The building has since been knocked down and is now a parking lot.
Heterosexual people felt comfortable attending Hamilton Lodge Ball as spectators, and LGBTQ people felt comfortable attending as themselves with their lovers, boyfriends, and friends.
Let's open up the curtain and take a look at our beauties. Let's hear it for them.
Over time, Harlem's ball scene evolved. In the 1960s and early 70s, the ballroom scene as we know it emerged, with the creation of the first house, the House of
House of
LaBeija.
LaBeija.
Pepper LaBeija, the legendary mother of the House of LaBeija.
The community is founded by what we would consider today to be trans women, or at the time as they were known as femme queens.
The houses, essentially teams, were organized like families with parents and children and competed against one another. The structure fostered artistry, but also provided support for young LGBTQ blacks and Latinos who had been shunned by their families.
Ballroom kind of created this opening in a way to celebrate yourself, to celebrate your culture, to celebrate who you are, and to be around your friends and be open and out and unapologetic in a certain way.
Like the earlier balls, many of the competitions of the 1980s and 90s took place in Harlem, including the ball that inspired the documentary Paris is Burning.
You can become anything and do anything right here, right now, and won't be questioned.
So much of what we see and hear in pop culture can be traced to the underground ball scene.
The category is royalty.
From Madonna's 1990 hit song Vogue, based on voguing, a dance style created by the ballroom community, to words that are now popular hashtags like shade, work, and realness. For years, many people didn't realize the origins of these contributions, and the community, made up of trans people of color, often didn't get credit. But now that's starting to change, and a group that has long been marginalized is beginning to be seen on its own terms through shows like RuPaul's Drag Race and Pose, both of which feature the people who are actually part of the scene.
I think that's part of people's fascination with ballroom is they're like, well, how are these people doing this thing? Well, I mean, we're doing it because we love ourselves and we love the people we're around, and, you know, we're not gonna let what other people think stop us.
All right, so take a minute to go to the Jamboard, which is this one, and just, I put sticky notes there, so you can just grab one of those sticky notes and answer this question. It'll take about 3 minutes to answer the question. Why might ballroom serve as a model for educators to understand how to create liberatory spaces for their Black, queer, and trans students? All right, we're still putting some answers, but I'm seeing some great things in the Jamboard already. We've got sense of belonging and community, creating safe, inclusive spaces, constantly inspired through learning history about this history, also wondering how much more is not being given credit. That's a great question. There's a centering of joy, of home places, freedom of expression, communities in the driver's seat, belonging and joy, power of being yourself. We've been here all along, exactly. Denigrates a whitewashed version of history, exactly. The ballroom that they talked about in the 1920s, they talked about how Harlem was the scene, particularly during the pansy craze when a lot of this was going on. Langston Hughes actually wrote about this in his autobiography, The Big C. So there's an excerpt where he goes to a ball with Alelia Walker, who is Madam C.J. Walker's daughter. So we've been here forever, even though people think that maybe we haven't been. But a lot of the themes that I'm seeing in terms of what you're saying is this idea of community, family, being able to see, yourself and express yourself fully, and really kind of connecting to a history that maybe we didn't know previously. And these are all great, and I'm going to come back and read some more of them. So keep adding them because I love the ideas that y'all are putting there. That was the question. So basically, these two scholars, Brock and Bro and Shamari Reed, Dr. Shamari Reed, they both wanted to study ballroom because they saw this kind of joyful centering of queer and trans, Black, and Latinx life, and wanted to know, like, what is it that we can learn from these spaces? In the case of Brock and Bro looked at two different community centers. He looked specifically at an LGBT center that was just like general LGBT, so maybe like a Pride center. And then he also looked at a LGBT center that was specifically geared toward Black and Latinx youth. So that specifically had that population in mind in their missions. And he wanted to see what the differences were between them and kind of extrapolate so that we could figure out how do we use that, you know, in a classroom or educational context. So some of the things that he noticed was that they had weekly Vogue reviews, such as they wear, youth practice voguing. So they would just come in, practice voguing, they would try out their moves, they would play ball house music and engage in performance and play and community building. That was specific to the organization that was specifically targeted to supporting Black and Brown queer youth. There was an explicit commitment to serving queer and trans youth, and it was central in the mission and design of the organizational planning and programming. That was a key factor he found that we could probably extrapolate into education by taking them and thinking about them in terms of the key design of all of our programming activities and whatnot. There was this adopting cultural practice of kinship and accountability that was recognizable to QD BIPOC, which is queer, trans, Black, Indigenous, people of color youth, on that in many ways mirrored the kinship and familial structures found within the ballroom houses. So a lot of times in the organization that was targeted towards QD BIPOC youth, they would call the volunteers and the leaders in the organization, they're like gay auntie, or they're, you know, my gay uncle, or, you know, something like that, my trans cousin. So they started adopting that kind of, not what we would maybe say non-professional language as part of the organization that helped to develop this community of kinship. And then they also engaged in community outreach to create sexual health and curriculum and programming. So they reached out to house parents, house mothers, house fathers, as well as members of the house community to see what their needs were in terms of the sexual health curriculum. And they infused that into the curriculum that they were designing. So it wasn't just a one-way, like they are creating the curriculum and they get to decide what you need, but they very much were doing outreach to the community. The difference between Brock and Bro and Shamari Reed, which they found a lot of the same elements to be super applicable to the classroom, but Shamari Reed, what he looked at specifically was talking to youth in ballroom to see how their experiences of agency and belonging differed in the ballroom context versus in a school context. And two of the major findings was that in ballroom, the youth felt that their agency was used to express their full selves. They were allowed to be playful, creative, and curious, rather than the ways that they're taught to suppress their, to us, LGBTQIA+ energy in schools. So a lot of the youth talked about how they were constantly thinking about like their mannerisms and the way that their voice sounded, and like various ways that our schools kind of police LGBT bodies. So that was constantly on their minds, and that's where their agency went into, rather than being playful, creative, and curious like they were in ballroom. And then the other thing is that it inspired a sense of belonging. that they weren't, some of them had been kicked out of their homes for being LGBT. So these were their new, chosen families. But they still had very strong sense of belonging in these networks. And even if they did have supportive families, they have extended it further and had this sense of belonging that was developed in ballroom in a way that they didn't feel they were able to develop in schools. So these two studies have been really impactful in my own practice and thinking about what I can do to move more towards a liberatory anti-racist mathematics education for Black, queer, and trans youth. And there are two prongs that I have kind of thought deeply about this. We're going to talk more about the first one, which is building communities of care. And then the second one is the abolition of PK to 16 mathematics as we know it. So re-envisioning what we think of as mathematics. And I know we're not all mathematics teachers, so we won't talk about that in great detail, but it will come up in some of the concepts we talk about. But some notes on care. So most of us typically think of teaching as a very caring profession. That is not exactly what we're talking about when we're talking about care. A lot of the care that sort of shows up in schooling, specifically schools, we have schools are typically led by white women. So a lot of times the version of care that shows up is one that is entrenched in a white feminist framework. That's not the caring that we're talking about here. The caring we're talking about here is one that's more influenced by a Black feminist framework. Because in Black feminist framework, caring means a little bit more than just being nice and feeling sorry for someone because of their circumstances and maybe lowering expectations, which is sometimes what we see happening in a white feminist framework with teachers. So here, when I'm talking about care, I'm talking about two different elements of care that get talked about, which is critical care, which is moving beyond meeting standards and passing tests toward building relationships that contribute to a more caring humanity while also keeping high expectations. So it's about that community and relationships and caring, but also high expectations. And then culturally responsive care is a process in which one's humanity is affirmed by building community, trust, warmth, demanding, and integrating the cultures and experiences of community members. So culturally responsive care is really about bringing in elements and seeing the whole person and figuring out how do we make that whole person, all parts of them, part of the community in the same way that I do in ballroom. So some of the examples that I've come up with that kind of talk about this. First is prioritizing community building to inspire belonging. So a lot of us do this at the start of the year, right? We have community building activities and we maybe set community agreements with students. And the first few times I did this, I never thought to revisit them or, do it again because content ends up ruling the day. But we need to make the shift if we're actually making communities of care where content is still important because we still need to have high expectations, but we also need to be intentional about building in community building activities throughout. So something that I've done is I co-create community agreements with my students. And there's actually a PowerPoint link of what I'm doing with my students next week in the university course I'm teaching. We're doing a stations activity. So if you want an example of what that looks like, there's a link there for you. And what I do with that community agreements, once we have them, is that's what I'm going to use for my participation rubric in the class. So it's a rubric that the students have created, and then at the end, they're going to self-assess themselves on that rubric to see, in terms of participation, how do they think they did throughout the semester or throughout the quarter or whatever it is you're doing. And then I also build in regular opportunities to revisit the community agreements. So I'm very intentional about every 3 or 4 meetings. I make sure that we go back to the community agreements and we do a poll, a class poll of what are we doing really well with, what are we struggling with as a community, and then I have them do it for themselves as well, individually, to think about like the areas that they're doing well in and those that they might need growth. And then from that cycle to the next poll, what I do is I use something that they create when they make the community agreements. They usually do a foldable. That's a look like, what does this community agreement look like, sound like, feel like? And so we use that as the basis of essentially the participation feedback we give to each other in class. And they also give me feedback using that. So like if they say, you know, I don't think we did a good job this week of, you know, being active listeners. So some of the groups have made a beautiful presentation of what active listening looks like, sounds like, and feels like. So they look at that throughout the week and they provide each other and me feedback about like how we're doing in terms of active listening and how we can improve. So that's what I mean by being intentional and building in, prioritizing community building to inspire belonging. The next thing, I build in regular check-ins to center collective well-being. So every class, at the end of every class, I give them an exit ticket that says, what are you thinking and feeling in relation to what we did today? And they answer this on Google Classroom. They know from the start of the year that they can answer this in any way they want. So they can answer it by saying, I think the person next to me smells, could you please move me? Or, you know, like whatever it is they need to communicate with me personally, that's fine. They could also say, you know, my pronouns have changed. That's a perfectly valid communication. They could say, I really didn't understand this thing that we did today. That's a perfectly valid communication. So this is just something to open the channels of communication. And I also tell them that they don't have to submit it if they're not comfortable doing that. I want them to reflect and figure out like what it is they want to reflect on at the end of the period for 3 to 5 minutes. But if they don't want to submit it to me because they're not comfortable, then I have them just submit, I have completed my reflection. Most of them choose to submit it. I've only had 1 or 2 not, but it does kind of build that agency for them. Like I'm not going to push you to share anything with me that you're not ready to share with me. And I think that's important too. And then some other examples, I have been moving towards adopting something that disability justice advocates call CRIP time. CRIP time is basically this idea that instead of, you know, disabled bodies having to meet the expectations of time should have to meet the expectations of disabled bodies. So the way that I like to think about that, an example I use when I'm talking to my students is that, you know, sometimes we see someone crossing the street, going through the crosswalk, and there's a set amount of time for the crosswalk, right? Some people can't make it across the street in that time. We don't, like, the cars don't go anyway. Like, they see someone's in the street and they wait for that person to get across. So it's similar to that, like we're bending towards the needs of one another. So for that reason, I put flexible deadlines on things. I tell them suggested deadlines, and we have extensive conversations about like why they're suggested, you know, in terms of not making them become overwhelmed and me become overwhelmed with grading. It's like about the community. But like, if you can't meet the deadline, you can't meet the deadline. And that's okay too. So, but I will check in with you repeatedly if you do not make your deadline. So there's that sort of, and you need to communicate as well. So there's that communication happening. And then also UDL principles such as multiple modes of engagement and assessment, like in the Vogue review that Brockenbrough talks about, he talks about how the kids show up and engage in the way that they want to. Some of them are recording, some of them are interviewing, some of them are performing, some of them are standing on the sidelines, some of them are the center of attention, all these things. So, I mean, we know that intuitively that students engage with things in different ways. So that's something I try to be mindful in the assignments that I give them, and give them multiple options for how they're going to engage with the content and show me how are they going to access this content. So that's another thing. And then the final one is bringing in elements of community into the classroom. So that includes things like incorporating real life context based on students' interests or lives. So I'm teaching a mathematical mathematical proof and proving class right now. And I've done a student survey to see what their interests are, because our real life contexts are all going to come from their interests, and they're going to write mathematical arguments based on data, based on the interests that they have. So ways that you can kind of bring that into the classroom is super helpful. A different example, I teach a summer mathematics enrichment for students entering high school who identify as 2S LGBTQIA. And I have a community centers task where I teach them about the history of community centers, like pride centers, how they became developed, you know, what are they, what options do they provide, is there one near you, those sorts of things, which are really helpful things for them to know. And then we look at a map of the state of New Jersey, and we talk about, you know, what they, we talk about where the centers are located and if people have equitable access to it, and what does that mean? And then we use mathematics to propose the location of a new one, a new center, so that we can increase equitable access. And all of that is done using mathematics and using kind of the shared history of LGBT identity in the camp. So those are some of the examples. We're going to take a minute now to shoot you off into breakout rooms. Does anyone want to share something that particularly resonated with them in their breakout room? We have time for one share. I know, there's one. Benny?
One thing that really made me think in my group is talking about how we can have students, LGBTQ students, feel celebrated in spaces outside of GSAs, like in classrooms as well.
Yeah, it's really great. And that actually brought up something that a lot of people mentioned in the groups that I was able to hop into, but they talked a lot about thinking about joy and how do we really bring in that joy. And in math, we do a lot of social justice context, math for social justice. And I think a lot of times when we do those, we have this intention of kind of shining a spotlight on injustice. But sometimes what happens is that ends up making us lose the joy, because there's not this reframing. There's like this frame of this is what communities lack, rather than this is what communities, this is the abundance of those communities. And if we watch, like when we watch that video, there's so much abundance and so much joy in the ballroom community. So if we think about, like, even if I'm doing a math for social justice lesson, that's why that community center task was based on community centers as an asset, because I wanted them to know that rich history of how beautiful it was for people to come together and to advocate and like to see themselves and show that there is agency and power in that way. So I saw that some of y'all put sticky notes on the Jamboard. Y'all have access to that after we leave. So hopefully you can like peruse those ideas. But otherwise, I want to be mindful of the time. If you want to be in touch, you can continue to be in touch with me via email. I signed you up for my newsletter very sneakily when you agreed to the community agreement. Feel free to unsubscribe from that if you want, though. And then if you're in math, Stolbach's Equals is a LGBT focused group in math education. So that's something you can look into. There's a link for that. And then you can also look into Radical Pedagogy Institute, which I'm the co-founder of. My co-founder Leah was here, might have hopped off because we have another session right after this, so might be getting ready. But that's another way that you can get involved and learn more.